Welcome to part 2 of Essentia Foundation's course on Analytic Idealism. In part 1, we've seen that our screen of perception, the things we see, hear, touch, smell, and taste, the screen of perception is not a transparent window into the world. It doesn't show us the world as it actually is in and of itself. The screen of perception is more like a dashboard of dials. And these dials, these instruments on the dashboard, convey important, accurate information about the world so we can survive. This is what evolution has equipped us with, a dashboard of dials to convey important information about the world. But these dials are not what the world actually looks like, in the same sense that the instrument panel of a pilot flying a plane purely by instrument, that instrument panel is not the world outside. It doesn't look like the clouds, the lightning, the wind, whatever is beyond the windshield of the aircraft. But despite not looking at all like what the world actually is, it conveys accurate and important information that allows the pilot to fly safely purely by instrument. So this is what we are. This is our condition. We are flying purely by instrument. What we see, hear, touch, taste, and smell are the instruments. Vision is an instrument. It's a dial on the dashboard. So is taste, so is touch, so is hearing, and so on. These are all the dials, the instruments evolution has equipped us with. But the world as it actually is doesn't need to comply at all with the paradigm of the dashboard. In other words, things like space, extension, the passage of time, objects, discrete objects, even forms themselves, they belong in the dashboard. They are the extensions or dimensions of the dashboard. The world as it actually is doesn't need at all to comply with this paradigm, this spatio-temporal paradigm of forms and extension and the passage of time. It can be something that is for us literally unimaginable and inconceivable, because we can only conceive and visualize things that are in some way commensurable with the paradigm of perception. Perception feeds our imagination, our ability to conceive and visualize things. So whatever is incommensurable with the paradigm of perception is, in principle, inconceivable to us. So we are immersed and living in a literally mysterious and inconceivable world. And what we see and hear, what we perceive in general, is just, the dials in our dashboard conveying the information we need to survive and to maintain our structural and dynamical integrity despite the second law of thermodynamics. So all of this has been covered in part 1. I will be linking part 1 in the description of this video. If you haven't watched it, I would recommend that you do watch it first, even though I already gave you a summary. Do watch that first before you watch this part 2. And in this part 2, we are going to talk more specifically not only about the incoherence of our intuitions of what reality is, but specifically the incoherence of our mainstream metaphysics, our mainstream narrative about the nature of reality. In other words, mainstream physicalism, or metaphysical materialism, whatever you want to call this, the notion that matter, this thing that is describable purely by quantities, is the only thing that exists, and that qualities and experience and consciousness and mentation, these are all somehow secondary phenomena. So this is mainstream physicalism. We will be talking much more specifically about this in this part 2. So let's get going. Now, physicalism assumes that the shapes and forms, or the contours of the things in the world as they appear on the screen of perception, really are the forms of the world as the world is in and of itself. So although physicalism will grant that the colors we see, they are qualities, and therefore they are generated by our brains inside our skull, really out there are no colors, there are no qualities, there are only electromagnetic vibrations of certain frequencies, but they do not have the quality of redness or blueness or whiteness and so forth. So materialism grants that these qualities are only inside our heads, but it goes ahead and says that the abstract geometrical relationships of the world do correspond to the contours we see on the screen of perception. So there is a very important sense, very major sense, in which physicalism says that, well, the world is actually largely the way it presents itself on the screen of perception, because the forms are the same in both, on the dashboard of dials and in the world outside. Now, in principle, that already doesn't make much sense, right? I mean, the forms and dimensions of the instruments on an instrument panel are not at all the forms of the world out there. You can have circular dials with a circular shape, but the stuff out there doesn't need to be circular. The paradigm of the instrument is defined by evolution to be useful, not to be truthful. So that's already something tricky about mainstream physicalism. It's an assumption that we need not make at all, that we shouldn't make. We do not have any good reason at all to make this kind of assumption. But physicalism does that. And in a nutshell, the assumption is the forms that appear on the screen of perception are actually the forms of the world as it is in itself. So the world does have spatial extension, and geometrical relationships that are consistent with the geometrical relationships of what appears on the screen of perception, the things we can see. Now, materialism then takes the next step. Having made this arbitrary assumption that the forms of the world are the same as the forms of the screen of perception, of the dashboard of dials, it then takes the next step, which is a useful step if it weren't abused. So I'll tell you first what this step is, and then I will explain how physicalism abuses of it. Physicalism then says that the world as it is in itself, the objects whose contours appear on the screen of perception, that those objects can be described through quantities. So for instance, if I have a heavy piece of luggage whose shape, whose form, as it is in itself, is the same as the shape that appears to me when I look at it, and I define that object based on its contours, and I call it a piece of luggage, I can describe, for instance, how heavy it feels to carry that object. I can describe that with a number, like y kilograms. Angles I can describe with another number, like x degrees. Size I can describe, or distances I can describe with another number, like z meters, and so on and so forth. A number for amplitude, another number for frequency, for electric charge, for momentum, spin, and so on. So you get the picture. So these numbers indeed are very useful descriptions of what appear on the screen of perception. It's arbitrary to say that these numbers are describing the world as it is in itself, because the forms on the screen of perception, or the objects as defined by the contours on the screen of perception, do not need at all to be anything like the forms in the world as it is in itself. Even the idea of form belongs in the paradigm of the dashboard, not in the world as it is in itself. But okay, having made that concession, the numbers are useful. But then there is an abusive step. Physicalism forgets that these numbers are merely descriptions of something else. They are descriptions of the thing described. Physicalism then goes ahead and defines this ontological entity, or substance, or ousia, which is the original Greek word which the scholastics have translated into substance. It basically means an entity that has standalone existence, that is ontically real, not secondary, not derivative, not epiphenomenal. So physicalism postulates this substance, this thing with standalone reality that they call matter. Now, of course, there is this thing we call matter colloquially, but physicalism has a strict conceptual definition of what matter is. And that definition entails that matter can be exhaustively defined through quantities alone. In other words, if you provide a complete list of numbers about matter, then you've said everything that there is to say about matter. Nothing is missing. Everything that there is to be said about matter can be said through a list of numbers. Matter can be exhaustively defined through quantities, not qualities. Now, this is a very big step because, one, it's postulating something beyond nature's given. Nature's given, the only thing we have before we start theorizing about reality is experience. And experience is qualitative in nature. To say that there is something beyond experience, which is purely quantitative in nature as opposed to qualitative, is a theoretical postulate. It's not an empirical given. And as a theoretical postulate, a not parsimonious one, because you're postulating something extra, you're postulating something beyond the nature's given, it has to be justified. We will look at whether this is actually justified or not, but this is what mainstream physicalism does. It takes these descriptions of the qualities on the screen of perception, it takes those descriptions, and then it postulates an entity that can be fully captured by these quantitative descriptions alone. That after you describe it with a list of numbers, there is nothing more to be said about that. And that's called matter. Now, notice that even the contours, if I go back to this slide, you see these contours here of the city. These are all contours which physicalism postulates to be in the world as it is in itself, and correctly mirrored on the screen of perception. Now, these contours, you're seeing them here because I'm using two colors, black and white, or all colors and the absence of all colors, black and white. And these are qualities. So in a sense, what I'm showing here is not accurate. The contours alone do not have even whiteness or blackness to them, in the sense that both whiteness and blackness are qualities, and the world as it is in itself, according to physicalism, has no qualities because it's purely material, and matter is fully and exhaustively described in terms of quantities alone. It has no qualities. Under mainstream physicalism, qualities are generated inside our skull by our brain. They are not out there in the world. So the world doesn't even have these qualities of black and white contours here. It's not there. So am I cheating? Well, not really, because I cannot help you visualize something that has no qualities at all, since every visualization entails some form of qualities. So in reality, what is really out there are just the geometrical relationships, the abstract geometrical relationships entailed by these little contours that I am showing you here. But the world as it is in itself, you can't even visualize like these black contours on a white background. It's pure abstraction. It's not visual, it's not visualizable. The best you could do is to imagine it as empty space with floating mathematical equations, like I'm trying to show here. But even that goes too far, because it also has colors. The world as it is in itself, according to mainstream physicalism, is pure abstraction. Absolutely pure abstraction. Now comes the worst step physicalism makes. We are part of the world. And as such, we too are only these little abstract contours, these geometrical relationships described fully through quantities and and equations that relate quantities to one another. When we look at the world here, there we are a little contour looking at other contours, then something magic happens here inside this abstract object called the brain, and poof, the qualities come into existence. So the world we actually experience, the world of color, sounds, flavors, melodies, textures, that world, according to mainstream physicalism, exists only here, inside our head. If you look up to the sky at night and you experience the qualities that we call the stars, those stars, insofar as you see them, are below the inner surface of your actual skull. Because the qualities of the night sky, which is all we have when we look up and see the night sky, they are supposed to be generated by your brain inside your skull. There is something abstract beyond your skull, which we call a star. But that something abstract is not your experience of the stars. It's something abstract that supposedly is modulating your experience of the stars. But the experience we call seeing the stars happens inside your skull. The inner surface of your skull is beyond the night sky insofar as the night sky you experience, that you see. That is mainstream physicalism in a nutshell for you. Now, notice what's happening here. We start from a world of qualities. And then we say we can describe those qualities through quantities, like kilograms, hertz, amplitudes, charge, momentum, geometrical relationships, angles, and so on and so forth. So that's a description of the world of qualities, which is all we have. And then mainstream physicalism goes and says, actually, all that exists is the description. This world of qualities here is epiphenomenal. It may not even actually exist. It may be an illusion. All that exists is this abstract world of contours and quantities. That's all that exists. This here is an illusion generated inside your head. And then physicalism says, and these qualities here, they are somehow generated by these abstract quantitative contours here, your brain. So this is basically saying that that which is described somehow arises from the description. That somehow the description of the thing precedes and is more primary than the thing described. It's completely analogous to trying to pull the territory out of the map, because what is a map? A map is a description of the territory. We all start with the territory. We all start with experience. That's what we have when we are 5 years old, before we start conceptually theorizing and coming up with this crazy narratives like mainstream physicalism. That's all we have. And then we find out that it's very useful to describe those qualities with numbers, and it definitely is very useful to do that. But then, that's like creating a map, and maps are very useful. And physicalism then says, well, the experiences actually arise from their description. The territory arises from the map. Is this reasonable? Is this even sane? I submit to you that it's on the edge of sanity. It can be something that you believe if you think casually about things, if you don't go in depth. But after a couple of 100 years of mainstream physicalism, having had the time to think this through, it doesn't take much effort to think this through, I don't think this is reasonable. I think it is on the edge of sanity, and it's only taken seriously, it only has a degree of plausibility because we have massive cultural consensus around it, unthought through cultural consensus whose great advantage is that it's based on inherited assumptions, unquestioned inherited assumptions. So the plausibility of mainstream physicalism is culturally manufactured. It's not something that arises from clear objective reasoning or evidence. It doesn't arise from that. So in a nutshell, according to physicalism, the world is made of these abstract entities called atoms and elementary subatomic particles. You cannot visualize them because they have no qualities in and of themselves. They are just describable through quantities and the mathematical equations that relate these quantities to one another. So the world as it is in itself is a set of abstract quantitative relationships, abstract mathematical relationships. And when we, equally abstract entities, look at the world, then these abstract quantities inside our head, which we call brain, somehow magically generates the actual world that is given to us, or the dashboard, the qualities, the instrument panel that we have. These qualities are supposedly epiphenomenal. They are secondary side effects, literally side effects, because they don't have any efficacy. They, under mainstream physicalism, experience does nothing. It doesn't belong in the causal nexus of the world. Experience just accompanies the fall of the dominoes that is supposed to be causally close purely in abstract terms. This is what mainstream physicalism basically says. Now, there is, of course, an encapsulation of the key, well, I could say difficulty, but the key insoluble problem of physicalism. And to be able to frame this problem correctly, I think, is halfway to the solution. And the framing of this problem was done back in the 90s by this guy here, David Chalmers. There he is. He is probably the best known philosopher alive. I know Dave, and he doesn't put himself down, but he likes to say that, well, I did nothing back in the 90s. Everybody knew about what I called the hard problem of consciousness. All I did was to frame it unambiguously and clearly in few words. Instead of some hand waving and, that was going on at the time, he just framed it very clearly. And he doesn't think that this is a big deal, what he did. Well, I happen to think it was a very big deal, because framing a problem is halfway to solving it, or halfway to seeing it not as a problem, but as just a reduction to absurdity of certain assumptions, which is what I think this is. But since then, it has become known as the hard problem of consciousness. And it can be framed as is written here. There is nothing about the physical properties of the arrangements of particles making up our brain, in terms of which we could deduce, at least in principle, what it feels like to fall in love, have a bellyache, or look and taste an apple. For matter is defined precisely as that which lacks all felt qualities. So if you say that matter is exhaustively defined by a list of numbers, and numbers are, of course, have nothing to do with qualities. Quantities and qualities are two incommensurable domains. If you define matter as pure quantity, of course, you can never deduce qualities from that, unless you have an empirical mapping. But that doesn't show you that matter is generating experience. It just shows you that there is a correlation between a description and the thing described, which, of course, there is by construction. A correct description is constructed so as to correlate with the thing described. So he framed this in a way that makes it clear that this is not really a problem that can be solved in the future. This reveals an internal inconsistency of the mainstream physicalist narrative. You cannot start from qualities, then describe them through quantities, and then try to replace the reality of the qualities with those quantities, and finally try to pull the territory out of the map. Try to deduce qualities from those quantities that you replaced reality with. You replace the reality of the world with its description. You replace the territory with the map, and you're trying to recover the territory from the map, which is absurd. Of course, you cannot succeed in that. And this is how this framing of the hard problem allows you to realize that whatever acrobatics, theoretical or conceptual acrobatics we do, there is a fundamental incommensurability between quantities and qualities. The correlation between the two is not because quantities generate qualities, it's because we created the quantities so as to describe the qualities. So let's try to wrap this now based on this discussion. Can we say that mainstream physicalism is 1. Logically coherent, 2. Internally consistent, 3, conceptually parsimonious, 4, empirically adequate, or 5, explanatorily powerful. Note, these 5 questions are the key values of the post-Enlightenment world, of our rational culture. We value logical coherence, we value internal consistency, we value conceptual parsimony. We have a name for that. You know, if you comply to Occam's razor and you survive Occam's razor, then your theory is conceptually parsimonious. Otherwise, although it perhaps can't be disproven, we don't need to take it seriously. So that's conceptual parsimony. We enormously value empirical adequacy. If you have a theory about reality that is contradicted by certain empirical facts, observable facts, then your theory is wrong. And we, of course, value explanatory power. If we have a theory of reality that doesn't explain the most important things, the most obvious things, then your theory is pointless because it doesn't explain anything. And the point of a theory is to try to make sense of things. So let's evaluate mainstream physicalism according to these post-Enlightenment values, which are espoused by every serious thinking physicalist in the world today. Number 1, is it logically coherent? I would say it is not, because you see, it is trying to explain mind, consciousness, experience, qualities. It's trying to explain these mental things in terms of an abstraction of mind itself, namely matter, as conceptually defined under mainstream physicalism. Mainstream physicalism postulates this theoretical entity, this theoretical abstraction called matter, which is exhaustively definable in terms of quantities. This is a theoretical postulate, an abstraction of the physicalist's mind. So, and then the physicalist tries to reconstruct or explain his own mind in terms of an abstraction of his mind. This is like a dog chasing its tail at light speed. I mean, it doesn't matter how fast you go, you're not going to catch it because it's just logically incoherent to do that. Now, is physicalism internally consistent? In other words, are all its postulates and tenets consistent with one another, or are there internal contradictions in physicalism? I would say there is a flagrant internal contradiction under mainstream physicalism, which is the following. After it defines matter conceptually as that which has no qualities, because matter is supposed to be exhaustively describable through quantities alone. So it defines matter as that which has nothing to do with qualities. It has no qualities intrinsically or inherently. It then tries to account for qualities, for experience, in terms of matter. Now, these are two things that are not internally consistent. You cannot try to account for qualities in terms of something that you came up with and defined in such terms that it doesn't have any qualities, that it's incommensurable with qualities. Now, is mainstream physicalism conceptually parsimonious? I would say it is not. For something to be conceptually parsimonious, it has to make only as many conceptual postulates as absolutely necessary to explain things. And physicalism makes this postulate beyond nature's given. Nature's given, all we have when we are 5 years old and before we start theorizing, is experience. The world around us is a world of qualities. It's a world of experience, of colors, of sounds, flavors, smells, textures that we feel. These are things we feel, qualitative things in experience. That's nature's given. What mainstream physicalism does is it says, well, next to these experiences, and fundamentally outside and independent of these experiences, there is something else which is not experiential at all. We will call it matter, and we will say it's fully definable in terms of quantities alone. So you're postulating an extra beyond nature's given. You're postulating an extra beyond immediate experience. And then that would be justifiable if you cannot make sense of things without making that postulate. But as I'm going to argue in part 4 of this course, we can make sense of everything in terms of experience alone. So on that basis, mainstream physicalism is not conceptually parsimonious. It fails Occam's razor. Is it empirically adequate? I would say, well, recent experimental results from the fields as diverse as neuroscience of consciousness and foundations of physics flat out contradict mainstream physicalism. In foundations of physics, since the late 70s, there have been increasingly more sophisticated, loophole-free verifications of what is technically called Bell's inequalities and Leggett's inequalities. And verifying those inequalities has come to a point now in which it is way beyond reason to deny that there are only two options on the table. Either what we call physical entities, material things, either they do not have standalone reality. Matter is actually secondary, it's not primary. It's the way something else, non-physical, non-material, is presenting itself to our observation. Either this, or there has to be countless gazillions of new physical universes being born every infinitesimal fraction of a femtosecond, for which we have precisely zero empirical evidence. Now, you take your pick. My pick is obvious. Of course, matter has no standalone existence. Of course, the physical world has no standalone existence, because it is the dashboard of dials. And the information on that dashboard of dials is not arising from the dashboard, it's arising from the real world that the dashboard of dials is measuring, is observing. That real world is what is primary, is what has standalone existence, not the position of the dials. The position of the dials is secondary. It arises from a measurement of the real world, which we cannot see directly. So, of course, if physicality is your dashboard, of course physicality has no standalone existence. And that's why Bell's and Leggett's inequalities are experimentally verified again and again and again for 40 years, with all loopholes closed. Why did we make it so difficult on ourselves? Because we have this physicalist prejudice. The result is obvious. Of course, physicality does not have standalone existence. It's not there before you measure, in the same sense that the dials are not giving you indications of what's going on outside, unless the outside is being measured, unless the outside is being observed. And even in the neuroscience of consciousness, there is now a variety of totally independent but converging lines of evidence showing that there are consistent cases in which significant reductions in brain metabolism, brain activity, but I define activity as metabolism. Significant reductions in brain metabolism are accompanied by mind-boggling increases in experiential richness and intensity. Now, if brain metabolism somehow is or generates experience, you would expect there to be some kind of proportionality, direct proportionality between the two. You wouldn't expect experience to explode in richness and intensity while your brain is effectively going to sleep. So that's also hard to make sense of under mainstream physicalism. So it is not empirically adequate. And finally, is it explanatorily powerful at all? Well, I would say this is the worst of the 5 criteria as far as physicalism is concerned, because it cannot explain experience. Remember the hard problem? There is nothing about physical parameters in terms of which we could deduce the qualities of experience, at least in principle. So there is a strong sense in which mainstream physicalism explains precisely nothing, because experience is all we have. Everything beyond experience is a theoretical abstraction that is itself experiential. So, I'm sorry, physicalism doesn't explain much at all. And then you might ask, let me add some commentary here that I didn't plan, but I will add. Why did we come to physicalism if it's so bad? How did it happen? Well, it happened in the early days of science, and towards the end of the Renaissance, the beginning of the Enlightenment, when there was an enormous conflict between the nascent science and the church, which had full control, not only of the metaphysical narrative of the time, but over the whole society of the time. The church was, the lawmaker, the judge, everything circled around the church. And the church burned a couple of scientists. The famous case of Giordano Bruno, burned at the stake in the year 1600, is only one example. So scientists, Descartes specifically, they wanted to find a way to carve out a space for science to be done without scientists being burned at the stake. And one clear way to do that was to say, okay, there is mind, and that's the domain of the church, because mind in Greek is psyche, and psyche also means soul. So mind, soul, psyche, that's the domain of the church. We scientists will say nothing about that. But there is this other thing called matter, which is definable in terms purely of quantities. We will postulate that this other thing exists, and we will study only this thing. So the church has mind, and we have matter. And that was a great political move. And now, look, some might say, well, I am interpreting history wrong, and I have heard this from scholars, and maybe I'm exaggerating my point, but my point is not purely invented, because French materialists of the Enlightenment are on record. Diderot, for instance, said precisely this: materialism is problematic. It was called materialism at the time, mainstream physicalism. It's at least not complete, that's what he said. Because, we cannot account for subjectivity in terms of our definition of matter. However, we should keep on using it because it's a great weapon against the church. And I assume he meant a defensive weapon against the church. So this was going on. This was there. And other psychological dynamics played out in the late 19th century. I even wrote a paper about it, published on Sage Open, the world's best-read academic psychology journal, which reinforced this materialist narrative because of what psychologists call fluid compensation. And in the second half of the 19th century, when we killed God, as Nietzsche said, we killed God, when we abandoned the idea of an almighty, and we pronounced that was against reason and evidence, we lost that source of meaning that came from religious transcendence. Religious transcendence imparts meaning upon our lives, even when things are going wrong, and that's essential to healthy human life. And we lost that by rejecting transcendence at all. And so we had to find, or at least the scientists who were promoting materialism had to find another source of meaning through fluid compensation. And they found that extra source of meaning in identifying themselves as a rational elite who stared the tough facts in the face, who were brave enough to carry on despite the complete nihilistic absence of meaning in life, and who survived their own death through the work, this cosmological work they did in trying to make sense of nature and achieving closure. So these are all alternative sources of meaning which motivated the militant materialists and set the entire value system under which we live today. The notion that anybody who is an idealist is probably a irrational, new age, woo-woo, flaky person. Even if that person is leveraging only reason and evidence to much greater depths than the militant materialists. It set that value system to the point that today there are many militant physicalists or materialists who do not know what physicalism is. I mean, I always mention Jerry Coyne because it's the most extreme case of somebody who contradicts materialism all over the place in trying to defend materialism. And he's abundantly on record doing exactly that. The militants are not the people who really actually investigate the question. They are, through fluid compensation, trying to carve out a space of meaning for themselves. These are not neutral, objective people. But anyway, that's what I had to say about physicalism. In part 3, we are going to do a similar exercise for the new fashion in the metaphysical world, which is constitutive panpsychism, the idea that every, or at least some, elementary subatomic particles are conscious in and of themselves, fundamentally conscious, that consciousness is just another fundamental property of matter, like mass, electric charge, spin, momentum. Oh, you also have experiential states as a fundamental property of matter. I will argue that such an idea is physically incoherent. It contradicts what we know in foundations of physics, at least since the 1950s. And there are a number of other reasons why it's an untenable alternative metaphysics, despite being very fashionable today in academia. So stay tuned for that, for part 3. Again, I recommend you don't go and jump straight to part 3. I recommend you give yourself a day or two just to think about what you've heard today, to let it be integrated into your view of the world, let it have its effect, and then we go to the next part. So until then, stay safe, and I will see you shortly. Take care.